everyone, it's Annabelle and welcome back to my channel. In today's video we're going to have a nice relaxed talk about Phalaenopsis orchids and how I personally care for them, and some tips when using my kind of methods for beginners or people looking to try it out, things that I would kind of recommend and things I would say kind of not to do. Obviously this is something that's very specific to the way I'm keeping them in my environment, and that goes for everybody who talks to you about orchids. What they're talking to you about is kind of what works for them and general care tips. So I'm not going to generalise this and say that this is applicable to absolutely everyone in all environments. It certainly isn't. And if you're growing cooler than me, for example, you may want to keep things on the drier side and use organic media. But I'm just going to talk to you about what I found with Phalaenopsis and how I keep mine and how I successfully grow them, because obviously mine are very healthy and large and successful. They flower very well and I find Phalaenopsis very easy to grow. So I guess I wanted to just give you kind of a quick chat about my methods. Obviously amidst all the chaos at the moment, I thought it would be really nice to just sit down and have a chat about phals. So with that said, let's get started. So the first thing that I wanted to talk to you about phals is general kind of care. So mine are all kept in semi-hydroponic setups, which involves clay leca pellets, which are a rounded clay sphere which absorb water. So the water gets absorbed by the clay and is contained within a reservoir at the bottom and then travels up through the pot. So the orchids are in constantly moist systems. I'm also growing one in a kind of organic version of this, where it's in a mixture of leca, sphagnum and bark, and this one is also doing very well. I do keep this one constantly moist though, so something to bear in mind with my Phalaenopsis is I keep them constantly moist. So there's a lot of cultural information that says that they absolutely require wet-dry cycles. I've not found this to be the case. In nature, they'd be growing on tree branches in rainforests and getting constantly dripped on. So really, what they need is plenty of room for gas exchange around the root zone. And in organic media, it may be more important for the wet-dry cycle to be followed because it'll open up air gaps in that media. Bark, when it's wet, can kind of lose form, especially as it gets older and starts to break down a bit. So letting it dry really allows air gaps to open up. But if we've got a rigid media like leca, we don't necessarily need to let it dry out to maintain those air gaps, so we can have moisture and air gaps around the root zone at the same time. So that could also contribute to why I can keep my orchids constantly moist, even in moss mixes, because I'm keeping them warmer and I've still maintained aeration around the root zone. Gas exchange involves the photosynthetic reactions, which produce oxygen as a byproduct and use carbon dioxide, but also aerobic respiration, which is the type of respiration that all of our cells go through. So that involves requiring oxygen and producing carbon dioxide. So there's this constant kind of flux between oxygen and carbon dioxide around the root zone. And this is applicable to epiphytes and photosynthesizing roots with regard to the photosynthesis that's occurring. And Phalaenopsis roots will photosynthesize. You'll see that any wet roots are a green colour where they are producing chlorophyll pigment and photosynthesizing, and this occurs when they're exposed to light. Those that aren't exposed to light won't photosynthesize. So if I just show you, find a good example here. So the roots in this Phalaenopsis, which is in a self-watering system with leca, you can see, hopefully, that while they are green, they're also kind of yellowish because they're in a outer pot which doesn't let as much light through. So they're photosynthesizing, but to a lesser extent than, for example, my sweet memory Leodoro here. See if I can find a good side to show you some good roots on, where you can see that all of the roots are green where light is penetrating. So in theory, although the photosynthesis that occurs in a Phalaenopsis root is almost minimal compared to the amount that's going to be occurring in the leaves, it can still help to give you a bit of a balance around the root zone of the necessary gases required for the gas exchange. So I do think that it is beneficial to keep them in transparent pots. Not absolutely essential though, they can do just fine without it, but if we actually think about what the roots are doing when they're photosynthesizing, it kind of makes sense that for aerobic respiration to be occurring around the root zone, photosynthesis helps with that, I guess. They're kind of synergistic reactions. They might not necessarily be all occurring at the same time around the root zone, but they would be occurring to some extent. So I do think that makes sense. And I guess what I really wanted to do today is just get you guys to really think about culture. So this is going to be kind of just a general chat and maybe more advanced subjects, but I think it's really valuable to actually really consider why cultural advice is given and what that is actually meaning for the orchid. Because if we understand that, we can adapt things, we can process them much better than if we're just kind of told you have to keep your orchid dry, don't water it much. Well, they do kind of like water. And I would say that my phals, if we do a head test, my phals are pretty big. My phals flower very well. I'm obviously doing something relatively right with culture that I kind of wanted to discuss, because I'm doing things that go against what typical cultural information would tell you, and yet it works really well. So I guess if you take anything away from this, it's just to challenge kind of ideas and challenge cultural information that you're given and really think about it and what it means. So we've talked about how I kind of keep them in the semi-hydroponic setups, and I've positioned loads of phals around me to talk about, and they keep hitting me in the face, so I'm sorry about that. If I keep kind of moving this particular phal out the way, maybe I should have positioned it a little bit better. So as you can see, I get lots of flowers from my phals and they all do really well. One thing that I would say is I do keep all of my Phalaenopsis above 18 degrees Celsius. So we're going to talk a little bit about temperature, and this is particularly important in clay media and semi-hydroponic or constantly wet systems. So anything wet is going to stay slightly cooler than ambient temperature because of the evaporation that's going on. So that's kind of taking some of the heat energy away from around the root zone. So this might not be a problem if you're keeping your orchid on the drier side if it encounters cooler temperatures. If you're keeping your orchid wetter and you encounter temperatures below 18 degrees Celsius, I would say that's when you're going to start running into problems, just from my personal experience. So all of my Phalaenopsis, I keep a night temperature minimum of around 18 degrees Celsius, and day temperatures tend to be sort of 22 to 25 degrees Celsius in winter. Those are my winter minimums. They don't care about hotter temperatures in summer. They are hot growers and they love warm temperatures. So if anything, if you can't keep your room heated in winter, like my orchid room has kind of got lots of lights going, so there's a lot of excess heat energy that's floating around and I don't really need to provide any additional heating. A really good thing to do is pop your orchid onto a heat mat, because that will heat the root zone and combat any evaporative cooling that's going on. It also increases evaporation, so it'll disperse the moisture more evenly in the pot, which is very beneficial for orchids. So we've talked about temperatures and we've talked about how I kind of pot them. In terms of light, I give my phals bright light but under LEDs, so there's no risk of them burning like you would get from sunlight. The Phalaenopsis like bright indirect light kind of cultural information that's out there. Yes, but they will grow much better if you give them good, decent lighting without the risk of burning their leaves, obviously. A good way to feel if your Phalaenopsis is getting too much sunlight is to actually feel the leaves. So if on a sunny day you've got it in a window and you go along and you feel the leaf and it feels very hot to touch, that means that potentially the leaf is going to overheat, and that's when your risk of burning kind of increases. So under LEDs, I've never burnt a Phalaenopsis. All that I've ever had is under fluorescent lighting. Putting an orchid too near did cause some yellowing of the leaves. And this is where the chlorophyll pigments are taking in too much heat energy and they can't cope. So they start to kind of die back a little bit, and carotenoid pigments are amped up, which is a pigment that also helps orchids to deal with excess heat in the photosystems of the leaves. So that's a really good way to tell if your orchid is getting too much light. Just feel how hot the leaves are, because sunlight will generate a lot of excess heat energy. So it's more of a risk with sunlight than LEDs. Phals will grow much quicker if you give them good lighting. That's one thing I would say, along with good nutrients. So I feed all of my orchids quite high, but my phals in particular, I like to add a little bit of extra nutrients into their mixes because they are heavy feeders. Like, they produce huge structures. This requires a lot of energy from light, but also a lot of building blocks, which are the nutrients we're giving them, the nitrogen, the magnesium, the calcium. So those nutrients are all building blocks that the orchid can use along with energy that it gets from the light to build new structures, new pseudobulbs, new leaves if we're talking about monopodial orchids like Phals. So altogether, those kind of make up good culture, good watering practices, good nutrients, good light sources. I also supplement my nutrient feed with silicon, which is supposed to help to toughen and strengthen the leaves. I don't know if it does, but my Phals seem healthy, so I keep doing it. It doesn't hassle me at all, and it's very cheap. I also add seaweed extract, which contains growth hormones. So seaweed can grow very, very rapidly in one day. So it has a lot of plant growth hormones like auxins, cytokinins and gibberellins. Those are three that I can name off the top of my head, plant growth hormones that are involved in growth, new shoot production and new root production. So varying amounts of those hormones are useful in stimulating either new shoots or new roots, and Cakey Paste I think uses cytokinins. Off the top of my head I couldn't tell you the balance between the two that's the best, but I use Maxicrop seaweed extract, which seems to do very well. So it's got growth hormones that'll stimulate new root production, and I use this at a very low amount but with every watering basically. I increase the amount of nutrients I'm giving to my orchids in the active growing seasons, but my orchids are all growing year round. There's no dormant period for Phalaenopsis, and I think this is because I'm constantly giving them good watering, good nutrients, good light sources and heat, so they're always in kind of active growth. So for example, if you're growing them cooler in organic media, you might experience drops in growth during winter, in which case I would scale back the amount that you're feeding your orchids, because you will notice that they don't need as much. And what you do if you feed too much or too high salt content in your water, you will get a buildup of salt around the roots. So while we're on the subject of roots, I'll grab this little specimen here who has a lovely example of roots for me to talk about with you guys. This one's just finished flowering and we've got a large and extensive aerial root system. Aerial roots are completely normal. Orchids obviously attach to trees in nature, or epiphytic orchids do. So this means that they produce lots of roots like these that would help them to attach to the trees. So when these are in the media, I've just got this because I can literally point at roots, they'll be absorbing water and nutrients. And there's only so much they can absorb. So if you're feeding them very high levels that they can't absorb, either a nutrient that they don't absorb or a salt that they don't absorb, a mineral that they don't really need. For example, in tap water there are a lot of excess salts and nutrients and minerals that the orchid wouldn't necessarily need. Or if you're feeding them too high so that they can't absorb very much and there's just this constant buildup of salts and minerals around the roots, what you can get is a salt burn on your roots. Water will always move down the water potential gradient, so from low salt concentrations to high salt concentrations, because it always seeks to kind of reach an equilibrium with the amounts of solutes in solution. This applies to us because orchid roots have very sensitive root tips. So the root tips can potentially hit a salt layer and lose water from it, causing a salt burn on the roots. So it's very important to flush regularly if you're feeding high TDS, but I don't really flush that much, so that's another rule that I'm kind of breaking. I think this is because I kind of manage the amount of nutrients that I'm giving them with the amount that they're growing. So when they're producing leaves, when they're all kind of growing actively, I give them loads of nutrients. In summer, I probably feed about 400 or 500 parts per million, and that's my whole nutrient mix, so including silicon, seaweed, and my rain mix fertiliser, which is a complete balanced fertiliser that I really like. I think it's very important when you're feeding any orchid, particularly Phalaenopsis, because they are fast growers, and Vandas, things like that, to give them a good amount of nitrogen, magnesium, calcium. We've got other micronutrients that are very beneficial to include. I feed them as part of an everyday feed, and I will pop up on screen in the corner here the rain mix composition that I feed and roughly how many parts per million we're talking with my feeds of each nutrient. So I'll pop that up on screen here so you can have a look and pause that if you want to see that in more detail. So I've covered light, I've covered nutrients and watering. I keep my orchids constantly moist, but I think I can get away with this because I keep them at warmer temperatures and I balance aeration around the root zone, so there's always gaps for gas exchange. One thing that I haven't talked about is the growth habits. So some people will say that orchids will kind of take a break, they flower, and they will then start to produce new leaves. Well, mine kind of grow constantly. They're always making new leaves, new roots and flowering. And this one is actually working on a second spike at the moment. I hope that you can see that and that that's focusing okay. And opinion on whether to keep flower spikes is divided, but I tend to, except for when they get absolutely huge and I can't get them down off the shelves anymore, because orchids, and Phalaenopsis orchids in particular, and the complex hybrid orchids that we buy in shops are particularly prone to this, can keep their flower spikes for a long period of time and rebloom from the nodes along the spike. So this is an unused node and this is an unused node. So this orchid could potentially branch from either of these, and also it could continue growing the tip. So this is a spike from last year. It can also produce another spike and grow all at the same time if it's given enough energy from light, enough nutrients and enough warmth to keep going. So that's kind of how I keep my Phalaenopsis orchids. I hope that this video has been informative and interesting for you guys. And thank you so much for watching today. And if you did like this video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up or subscribe to my channel for more regular orchid updates. And I will see you guys later. Bye!